I was trying to upload a new
At least you're not a cat.
and I forgot how to do it. So
And we're live.
that again.
We're live.
We're live. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the February 26, 2021 CMP Policy and Implementation Committee meeting. I'm calling the meeting to order. Today we have Commissioners Avery, Irick, Lobauer, Lloyd, and Prickett participating in the meeting. And with the Executive Director, please tell me which staff members are participating today.
Stacy Roth, Paul Lakin, Brad Lanude, Ernie Deeman, Edwin Grosky, Betsy Piner, Susan Grogan, Chuck Horner, and Marcy Green.
Thank you and good morning, Nancy.
Good morning.
All right, so the Commission's first order of business is to adopt the January 29th, 2021 Policy and Implementation Committee meeting minutes. Is there a motion to adopt?
So moved, Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Lobauer. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Avery. All right, do commissioners have any questions or comments? I do. On page 12, Commissioner Prickett said the commission needs to hear what the counties and municipalities are doing relative to ORV damage. And this is the adjustment I think that needs to be made, and agreed with Commissioner Avery to convene a symposium of stakeholders. So I agreed with Commissioner Avery. I didn't
And my
suggest
motion
that.
to incorporate your amendment, Chairman.
I'll accept those.
All right, good. Okay, so it was revised. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, so all in favor of adopting the minutes, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the minutes stand adopted. Thank you. I'd like to also thank, on behalf of the committee, thank Betsy Piner for preparing the minutes on a monthly basis, pretty much. Okay, before the draft storm water management amendments are presented, I'd like to point out to the public that to participate in public comment today, you must call in and provide the meeting ID, which is at the top of the agenda and also on the screen. We look forward to hearing from you. Okay, so we're now going to have a review of the CMP amendments for stormwater management. Susan, who was involved in formulating the amendments?
Well, we have, I guess I'd call it a team, if you will, stormwater team, which is primarily Ed and Brian, who are with us today, Marcy, who's been writing the goals and learning all about stormwater in the process, and Stacy and I, and Nancy, and
Wow.
occasionally Chuck has been involved. And yeah, so it's been sort of an inter-office effort. And we have also reached out and had numerous discussions with DEP at every step along the way, and they've been very helpful.
Good, good. I appreciate that preface to the presentation. So Susan, if you're presenting this, I give you the floor.
Happily, I am not. That would be
Okay.
Marcy. Marcy's going to run through the presentation, and Brian will chime in with technical details and any other information you have. And I just want to emphasize at the beginning that these are the amendments that we distributed. Obviously, they are stamped draft on every page. We are still tweaking and refining some of the regulatory language. But today we do want to definitely go over the main concepts and changes and policies and show you how the different sections of the rule implement those policies. But I think the next time you see them in more final form, there may be a few word changes here and there. So we're still nailing down all of that. But we do think we're ready to show you a near finished product today. So with that,
Wonderful.
Marcy. Yep.
Hey, Paul, can you pull up the PowerPoint?
Yes, I have it up. It's taking a few seconds.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just start just with an introduction. Good morning, Chairman Prickett and
Good
commissioners.
morning.
So yes, I'm back to talk to you about stormwater. If you'll remember, back in September, we gave a presentation on how we were planning to amend the CEP stormwater management provisions, and we're back now, like Sue said, with a draft proposal that you should have all received in your packets. With the help of staff, the true stormwater experts, I'm going to walk you through the proposed major changes. I also want to add that if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. It's going to help you understand things better. You know, if you have any questions, don't feel like you have to wait until the end. Same with staff, feel free to jump in.
Thank you.
Marcy, I think I'm having trouble with connection right now.
Okay, do you want me to share it?
Sure. What's happening is that even the feed from Zoom is garbled coming through. I have a strong connection. I don't know why it's not working, but go ahead and give it a shot.
Okay, let me.
If there is a problem, we could go to the next topic and come back if that would be of any help.
Oops. Okay.
I got it now.
Okay, you're doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay, so we can go to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah. It's still going quite slow, but I'll
Okay.
get it.
All right, I'll speak slowly.
The audio is good at this point. It's a lot better than it was.
Audio is garbled.
So other people were having that same issue with the audio?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
So this process of amending the stormwater provisions was jump-started by DEP amending its stormwater management rule last year. The CMP currently incorporates key provisions of DEP's stormwater rule, so we needed to look closely at all of their changes to see if we needed to modify anything and to make sure that the CMP wasn't being less restrictive. This slide may look familiar. It's just a brief synopsis of some of the key changes to DEP's stormwater rule and the mandatory use of green infrastructure best management practices is probably one of their biggest changes. So Paul, if you want to go to the next slide,
Okay.
try to go to the next slide.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay, great.
It's still sounding a little garbled for me.
Oh, does everybody else hear it okay?
I do.
I do.
Okay,
I do too.
okay, great.
Going slow, I think, helps.
Okay. So the primary goal here is to harmonize the CMP with DEP's new stormwater rule in a manner that's best suited for the Pinelands area. The commission went through a similar process in 2006 after DEP last amended its stormwater rule back in 2004. So this also presented a good opportunity for us to review the CMP stormwater provisions and see how we could minimize impacts of increased stormwater runoff due to climate change. It was also an opportunity to see how we can strengthen and enhance stormwater management in the Pinelands area while establishing reasonable requirements for home builders and developers. You can go to the next slide. So this is just an overview of the proposed rule changes. I'll be going through each of these in more detail, but just an overview that the major changes are that we are going to be extending stormwater management for minor residential development and some minor non-residential development. You know, we had to look to determine which types of development should be required to address stormwater runoff. And We looked at residential development in the Pinelands and realized that stormwater runoff generated from the vast majority of residential development was not being addressed because under the current CMP, we don't require stormwater management for most minor residential development. So again, we'll go into more detail about that later. The next one is that we're going to, oh, I'm sorry, Paul. Sorry, the next bullet. Allow variances and exceptions for developments that can't meet the CMP stormwater management on site.
Marcy, may I ask you a question about that point?
Sure.
What sort of accommodations do we make for developments that can't manage stormwater on their own site? What sort of things are we going to encourage them to do?
So I will be getting into that one. I have a couple slides on that. Just want to point out that the CMP does currently allow for the commission and to grant exceptions and municipalities to grant variances for developments that can't meet the standards on site. We've decided to adopt DEP's new rules regarding variances and exceptions, what they call waivers of strict compliance, because their rules have much more detail than they used to, and we the conditions and standards that were in their rules. So again, I will be going into all of that in detail.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'll wait for that one. I just remember that one of the more controversial subjects we've had to deal with at the commission has been a development that wanted to handle its stormwater off-site. So anyway, I'll look forward to your slides.
Okay, great. And then the last one is we're going to be adding a specific recharge standard for nitrogen removal. And again, we'll go into that in a little more detail. Okay, Paul, thanks. So this proposal will require that stormwater runoff generated from the roof of a house of minor residential development will have to be retained and infiltrated on site through one or more green infrastructure BMPs, including rain gardens and dry wells. By requiring all minor residential development, which is defined as 4 or fewer houses, to address stormwater runoff would result in a lot more stormwater being infiltrated and retained in the Pinelands. So,
Marcy, I'm sorry.
No, go
Marcy,
ahead.
I just want, if I just want to have an opportunity to jump in for a minute. So in the process of us revising these rules, and in particular addressing the recharge of rooftop runoff from houses, it's well acknowledged that runoff from a rooftop is about the cleanest stormwater that you can find. But we want to recharge it through green infrastructure. Now, Brian and I had reached out to a couple engineers and scientists that were involved in stormwater management. And interestingly, one of the engineers suggested to us that dry wells could potentially be a capture point for snakes and frogs in particular in the Pinelands. And we consulted with John Bunnell, our chief scientist. John confirmed indeed that he's had experience where, in particular, small snakes, immature snakes, have gotten stuck. Fortunately, none have died, but they've gotten stuck in some of the trapping devices that they've used. So we put this additional requirement in here for dry wells. It's unique to the Pinelands, that they need to be constructed in a way that's going to prevent amphibians and reptiles, frogs and snakes from finding their way into a dry well and then not being able to get back out. I point that out because it's a great example of our interaction with the experts outside the Pinelands Commission, consulting with our own chief scientist, John Bunnell, and it's something that made its way into the regulations because we found after consulting all of these experts that it was a legitimate concern. I'm sorry, Marcy.
No, that's great. Thanks, Ed. Okay, I'm ready to, for the next slide, Paul.
Can we hold on if we can go back 1 second, Marcy, and I hate to interrupt you too, but I did want to remind the committee, I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but, and Marcy mentioned that by extending the stormwater management requirements to minor residential development, that will be requiring stormwater management for a much, much larger universe of development in the Pinelands area. And just to put that into perspective a little bit, we went back and looked at all of the residential development applications that we've received and have been completed over the past about 11-year period, just to see how many were falling into this minor development category, 4 or fewer units, and how many were for major residential development, which of course would be 5 or more units. And I fully expected there to be many more minor residential applications than major, but I was surprised by the very stark difference in numbers. So since January of 2010, that's when we started counting, we have received and there have been completed 50 applications for major residential development. And those range in size from 5, and the largest one was 777 units. So quite the range there. So 50 of those applications were completed with the commission in this time period. As opposed to minor residential, 4 and fewer, there were 767 of those applications received and completed with the commission during the same time period. So pretty much all of those 767 did not require any stormwater runoff management. So this new rule would have required all of those, the vast majority of development that's occurred in the Pinelands area, to provide for stormwater management through green infrastructure. So that's certainly a much larger universe of development that would be covered, which is a good thing. It's also, I feel I should point out, a lot of, it will require significantly more review time and work for the staff and for municipalities to deal with this much larger universe of applications too. But we do think it's important, and it certainly is a large impact in terms of numbers.
And so if I could add to that, and this requirement does set us apart from DEP. The rest of the state, under DEP's rules, does not manage stormwater from minor development. So it's currently unique to the Pinelands that we're proposing that level of management.
And actually, I would like to chime in too on Program's office. One of the challenges that we had in synthesizing the DEP rules as well as the Pineland rules, and which also brought this particular regulation up that we're proposing, is that the DEP, keep in mind that the DEP rules do not regulate minor development. They're only major development. However, their definition of major development is different than ours. The DEP's definition is clearing of an acre, and also, or the creation of a 1/4 acre of impervious surfaces. Now, the DEP rules have a requirement that, looking back to, I think, 2004, any development that has increased, looking back to 2004, once it hits that acre of clearing or 1/4 acre of impervious surfaces, looking back to that older date, then can qualify as major development. So we had a real issue struggling with this as a staff, because as you might be aware, we do have a lot of development that could be considered major development by DEP standards and then have to meet stormwater regulations, such as a 2-lot subdivision in, a rural development area. I mean, that could easily create, you have one house, it has less than what's considered major development by the DEP standards. But once you have another house, it's automatically major development. And how do we apply those rules? In the same sense, with a lot of development in the forest area, it's easy to have a single family dwelling have an acre of clearing because you have a 200-foot setback, you have a yard. So instead of having our staff have to think about and really wrestle with the differences in the definition between major and minor for our purposes in the CMP, as well as the DEP standards, we went through an analysis and determined that if we require this infiltration for just all single family dwellings, that would actually satisfy our requirements as we previously had, as well as the DEP's requirements, and also not have to get us involved in determining when something meets the DEP standards of major development. So this was a way that we felt really accomplished that, and also accomplished some other goals that we have in the Pinelands.
Thanks, Brian.
Sue, could I just ask, what what is the 10-year, 24-hour storm? How much rain is that, Ed? Do you know?
Yeah, well, Alan, it varies by county, but it's on the order of 5 inches. It's a little over 5 inches. Like Ocean County has slightly higher storm total than, say, Burlington. But all of the counties come in a decimal point or two off, but it's right around a 5-inch storm event.
And it has to be retained and infiltrated on the parcel, right? Correct?
It does. It does. And Alan, that's our current requirement.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're not going to have to do much if you're in a rural development area with a minimum lot size of 3.2 acres, I wouldn't think.
Right, because in this case, you're only collecting that water from the rooftop surface.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
I also have a question, Susan. It's Rick. I just wanted to ask if there's any evaluation of the kind of soil that is on the property. I don't know whether the best practice manual covers that, but is there any evaluation of the soil to see how permeable it is before a design is actually put together for this management?
So this is Ed. And yes, indeed, there, interestingly, back in 2004, 2006, when the Pinelands last revised our stormwater rules and developed a stormwater model ordinance, I'm going to say we were light years ahead of DEP with very specific soil testing requirements, because that was one of the things that we learned from some studies that we had done was many of these facilities were failing because the soil was just incapable of infiltrating these large volumes. So way back then, we incorporated some very detailed, rigorous soil testing requirements. In these intervening years, DEP has, in essence, caught up with the Pinelands, and they developed a new chapter in their BMP manual, and it's very good. It's very comprehensive. So rather than have two sets of standards, the Pineland standard and the DEP standard, which are essentially now duplicative, we're opting to go with the DEP's BMP manual that specifies the type of testing, the engineer certifications that need to be done both when the system is proposed as part of the design and in follow-up testing after the infiltration facility has been constructed. They've got to verify through additional testing that the original permeability assumptions that were made in the design were actually adhered to and achieved in the as-built condition.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. I know from living in the Pinelands that there are some areas that the soil is so thirsty, you can put gallons and hundreds of gallons into the soil and it doesn't run off. So that's why I think that's important. Thank you.
And Chairman, to that point, I'm sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
Just would like to ask a question.
Okay, I just want to add one thing to answer that
Yes.
last question. In the rule, the draft proposal that we sent you, there is a provision that spells out exactly the application requirements and exactly what applicants will, what tests they have to do and what results they have to provide to us. And I was going to point this out later. Right now, it's just under minor residential development, but it's one of those tweaks that Susan mentioned earlier that we'll probably making to take that application process out of the engineering plans and the soil tests and everything they have to provide to us and make that a requirement for all development. So right now it's just under minor residential development, but we're going to be likely taking that out and making that a requirement for all of it.
Thank you, Marcy.
I'm
I
sorry.
have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a question.
Okay.
We're storing and infiltrating the 10-year storm. DEP's requirements are 75, 80% storage of the 100-year storm. Was there any consideration given to marriage the two requirements?
Brian, do you want to take that?
I'm not sure which standard you're talking about, because currently the DEP's in their regulations require that the They look at a much smaller storm for infiltration. So are you speaking about the rates of runoff? Is that what you're referring to, Commissioner Irick?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So those standards will still have to be met by major development. That has not changed. That the runoff rate standards for major development haven't changed in the current DEP regulations and will continue to be the same for the Pinelands regulations. We don't have a requirement for minor residential development or minor non-residential development to demonstrate that they meet the runoff rate standard. So that continues to be a requirement for major development, but not for minor residential development.
Thank you.
Commissioner Irick, if I could just add to Brian's comment. So this is an issue that has caused confusion amongst even the experts. So when we talk about volume retention on site, we're talking about capturing that volume from the 10-year storm and putting it into a series of BMPs to make sure that it goes back into the ground. But there's also another component of volume, and that's what we refer to as the rate of runoff. So both DEP and the Pinelands, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, control the rate of runoff. So for these larger storm events where you're not retaining all that water on site, there's a requirement that the post-development condition can't have water leaving that site at a rate, cubic feet per second, that exceeds the pre-development storm event. So essentially, in those cases for controlling runoff rates, you're holding that water back, and this is for flood control purposes, and you're metering it out. You're allowing it to leave the site slowly and not running off, so that you're going to create a flooding condition downstream. So there's kind of two components of volume. There's the part that needs to be retained and infiltrated on site, and then there's the rate of volume that leaves the site, and that needs to be controlled for the 210 and 100-year storm. And that, like I said, is to prevent downstream flooding.
And that is in our standard.
It is.
That is in our standard, yes. And just to also add to that, when we're speaking about minor development, such as building one house, two houses, as the case may be, what qualifies as minor prior regulations, we're dealing with a small area of property, of a small watershed. And the methods of calculating rates of runoff, really, when you get down to an acre of property or below, they really don't mean much. The calculations and the way that we calculate through our regulations, through TR 55, are really designed to analyze runoff for larger areas. So really, it wasn't a concern for us as a staff to regulate the runoff from these minor residential developments. Also, understanding that really with the additions of these required measures, these green infrastructures, dry walls, what have you, that is going to, since we're going to proposing to infiltrate stormwater that today's standards do not require, that would result, in a reduction of rates off site, just for the mere fact that, there will be this requirement to retain and infiltrate stormwater, which is currently not being retained. So that just, when you think about it, will give you a reduction, even though it might not be a calculation, something that we can calculate to really quantify what that reduction is. It will result in a reduction of runoff from the site.
Yeah, I agree.
Any other questions? Paul, are you seeing the same issue with the screen sharing that I am? Or is
Yes, I just noticed that, and I don't know why it's doing that.
Green infrastructure.
Oh, there we go.
I see.
Actually,
Is
can I
that-
just interject for 1 second, please? Just to let you all know that Verizon is reporting issues in the tri-state area, so that's probably why we're having issues today. It started around 9:20, just to give you all the heads up that we may experience intermittent issues throughout the rest of the meeting.
Oh, great. Thank you for that.
Sure, sorry.
Marcy, is it back?
Yes.
Yes, it is back. Yeah.
Okay, I think I know what happened. It's very strange. I got it.
Okay. Okay, if there aren't any other questions for minor residential, we can move on to the next slide. So for minor residential development, likewise, to capture more stormwater from these minor non-residential developments, we decided to require that stormwater generated on motor vehicle surfaces be infiltrated and recharged on site to remove pollutants for development that results. So the standard, the size of what constitutes minor non-residential development is a development that results for non-residential purposes in an increase of 1,000 or more square feet of regulated motor vehicle surface.
Marcy, can I add to that a little bit?
Absolutely.
So these motor vehicle surfaces are really just like they sound. So these are going to be parking lots and cartways upon which motor vehicles are driving. So, we know that there's chemicals that are associated with pollution on these surfaces from leaking vehicles. And oftentimes that pollutant tends to bind to soil. And so what DEP requires for motor vehicle surfaces, it wouldn't apply to minor development motor vehicle surfaces outside the Pinelands, though, is that total suspended solid, the material to which those automobile pollutants are binding, get captured to remove that pollution before it enters the groundwater table. So the increase of 1,000 square feet was our way of basically attempting to capture pollutants that are associated with motor vehicles and prevent them from entering the groundwater table. The other thing that's important to note here is that we're not talking about the 10-year storm here. We're talking about, if you look at the rule, this is capturing that water quality runoff from what's called the water quality design storm. The water quality design storm is defined by DEP. Alan, you'll be interested in this, as a much lower storm event. So this is a 1 1/4 inch storm over a 24-hour period. And that volume equates to what's considered to represent what they term the first flush. So when you get a heavy downpour, much of that suspended solid gets carried and swept away in that first inch or so of rainfall. That's the volume that's the water that's most polluted. So we're capturing pollutants that are in that first flush, and that's where the majority of the pollutant would be contained in from these motor vehicle surfaces.
And I just wanted to point out that this definition of motor vehicle services, this is not we're not making this up. This is in the current or the new rule. So really, they're making this distinction between regulated motor vehicle surfaces and other impervious surfaces, which I think is a good distinction because they will have a different requirement for the TSS removal. But that is not something that we're adopting it by reference, but it is a term that is in the DEP's new and improved rules.
Thanks, Brian and Ed. I think we can move on to the next one. So the DEP rule addresses nitrogen and phosphorus removal from stormwater runoff by just requiring removal to the maximum extent feasible. And we're taking it a step further by setting an actual standard for the removal. So we would be requiring a reduction of total nitrogen load by a minimum of 65% on new development site, and that would include turf and managed vegetated areas. And just to point out again, just another minor change we'll probably be making is to clarify what we mean by turf and managed vegetated areas. We had discussed it before. We're going to be relying on another provision in the rule which kind of spells it out more. So we'll be including that in this section.
If you don't mind, before we move on, so I just want to remind everybody that nitrogen is the primary pollutant of concern in the Pinelands. If you go all the way back to the original studies that were done by the consultants that were hired, they identify nitrogen as the major problem in the Pinelands. That's the reason why we have these advanced treatment systems Coincidentally, they're also required to remove 65% of nitrogen from septic system effluent. To achieve 65% nitrogen reduction will take some effort. There's only one BMP that's been identified by DEP that's capable of removing that level of nitrogen, but you can get to that level by combining two different BMPs in series. So in essence, what we see happening is stormwater will be routed through a vegetated swale and then ultimately discharged to an infiltration basin. And when you combine the nitrogen removal from that overland flow that occurs in a vegetated swale, and then the nitrogen removal that occurs in the infiltration BMP itself, we can get to that 65%. And we think it's attainable. It's an improvement over the maximum extent practicable. And that's why we've selected 65% as that reduction level.
Ed, I've got a question for you. What is the nitrogen that we're seeking to reduce there? Is that like lawn fertilizers, garden fertilizers, things?
Yeah, that would be the primary source.
I see. Thank you.
So Ed, does this apply to minor and major development or just major development? I'm
This one's
confused.
minor.
This is still minor.
Still minor, right?
No,
No. Okay.
No, this is for major development.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, and just let me note, if you recall, what we said was that the stormwater that's being collected and recharged from minor residential development is from the rooftop. So there's virtually no nitrogen contained in that stormwater. That I mentioned, that's like about the cleanest stormwater that you can find. So this is really trying to address stormwater runoff from major developments where we're going to have managed turf, managed landscape areas, and that's where the nitrogen load would be coming from.
That's fine. I don't have a problem with that.
okay, moving on. So now, Commissioner Lobauer, hopefully these slides will answer your questions. The CMP currently has a section.
All right, thanks, Marcy.
I think I might have said this before. Currently has a section that authorizes the commission to grant exceptions for developments that can't meet the stormwater requirements on site. DEP's new rule has more detail than they had before, and we like the conditions and standards in their rule for granting these exceptions. So we're proposing to adopt them with some modifications. So for regular development, for private development, municipalities could grant variances, and for public nonlinear development, so like a parking lot attached to a school, not a road, a nonlinear development, the commission could grant an exception from the on-site requirements and allow that development to implement stormwater measures off-site. So I'll go into more detail. Next slide. So this is nothing new, but just wanted to clarify that if the standards can be met on site, a variance could not be granted. So I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that. The conditions for granting a variance for off-site stormwater management, which is also called mitigation, are that the measures have to be located in the Pinelands area, in the same municipality, and in the same HUC 14 or HUC 11 watershed area as the proposed development. Now, DEP's rule requires that the mitigation occur in the same HUC 14. We're expanding that, giving a little more flexibility to expand out to a HUC 11 if there are no sites within the HUC 14. Now, something we wanted to raise with you, we've been talking about whether we want to change what we have here to not limit mitigation to the same municipality. We think there could be rare instances where the best mitigation project would be in a different municipality as the proposed development. And we were thinking that maybe we want to leave that option open. So it's something we wanted to raise with you. Right now, the draft that was sent to you is what is on the screen, requires the mitigation project to be in the same municipality as the development. So Sue, I don't know.
Could you provide an example of how that would work practically?
I think I can, Commissioner Irick. So just to give a kind of baseline for what we have currently in the CMP. Our CMP does allow basically that you can, if you cannot meet standards on the property, that you can meet them, and if you can show you can meet them somewhere else in the Pinelands, that could be a possibility. We call it an exception. So that's what it's called in our rules. Now, staff had to come up with really guidance for how to do this because there's not a lot of language in the CMP to say specifically how to implement the exceptions. So for the DEP regulations, now understand that this is not a variance in the sense that you can just be waived from meeting the standards. So the DEP fortunately has laid out a lot of good things, which is why we like it, which we actually feel as a staff get to the heart of what our rule really wants or what our rule was really meant to approve. And specifically, the DEP rules require that the mitigation project be selected, that it be approved before preliminary or final of the approval subject of the development application, that the mitigation project be built either before or concurrently with the project that's being approved. So this was a good thing. This is a way that actually lays out specific timeframes for when the project needs to be completed so that we can ensure that it's completed. Now, in the case of municipal development or development within one municipality, we really think that in most cases, obviously if you're building in Evesham Township can only approve stuff in Evesham Township. I mean, that's just how it works by the municipal land use law. However, we could see a case where two municipalities, that are next to each other, there might be a development in one, and the municipality next door might have an issue that they would like to correct. Whether that's maybe the development is all going to the same stream that, there's a stream that the municipalities both border. So it would require that the municipality with the development where that's occurring, that they approve the development, but it would require also board approval for the development in the adjacent municipality. And while that could present a lot of issues or, create a lot of hurdles, we don't think that that's an impossibility that could actually happen, especially for those municipalities that do border some of the same waterways, that there could be one municipality that wants to develop, but the solution to meeting standards could be in the other municipality. So both municipalities might benefit from that. Again, it can be difficult, but not something that, we necessarily want to prevent from happening.
If I may add to that. So Commissioner Irick, as an example of how this might actually work, a couple years back, we had a municipality that was proposing development on a site that had such clayey soils, they couldn't meet our groundwater recharge standard on site. So Brian and I went out in the field and we looked for other areas in that town where there were obvious existing stormwater management problems. We identified some pretty severe street flooding that was occurring in the town. We also identified areas where runoff from streets was being directed directly into a wetland system. Now, this was old development. This is stuff that preceded the Pinelands Commission. So in that case, what we suggested to the town was you couldn't meet the recharge standard on your development site, but here are a couple examples where we've got existing, in one case, flooding problems, in another case, discharge to wetland problems. If you're able to create an infiltration facility and recharge the same volume of water that you'd be required to recharge on your development site and do it off-site and remedy these problems, that would have been considered to be an acceptable mitigation measure under our current CMP.
But isn't that the whole process of testing the soil to make sure that the infiltration basins are on a particular site or placed in an area that will work?
It is. So in this case, the development site, the testing on site demonstrated that the soils were not suitable for recharge. They hit clay at a shallow depth, and as far as they dug, that clay extended down.
Like
so they couldn't meet that standard on site. But if we could have identified, I'm sorry.
Maybe they should not have developed that site.
Well, you know, that would have been the outcome if the exception or mitigation measure was not available to them. Now, in this particular case, and every site is going to be different, this was a public development site that was proposing the construction of athletic fields, soccer fields, baseball fields, and the like. So it was public development. You know, the town identified the need for those recreational facilities. There was in our current rule a mitigation option. So exercising that option would have allowed those ball fields to be constructed with the mitigation resolving existing stormwater issues in the municipality. In this case, it would have been in the same HUC 14. As it turned out, the project didn't move forward, but that's an example of how a mitigation project could allow for development to occur if in the mind of the commission, it was a suitable, what do we call it, variance that could be granted.
I speak for myself, but I personally am not in favor of mitigation outside of the initial community or township.
I share your concern, Commissioner, and the reason I raised the question earlier about this was I wanted to be sure that we weren't running the risk of allowing an exception that would cause stormwater to be lost from the watershed of the location. It appears that we're protecting the watershed by requiring an exceptional circumstance to discharge the stormwater, although off-site, back into the same watershed. But I'm also concerned about whether or not when we concentrate stormwater like that and discharge it somewhere else, are we going to be causing problems like the circumstance that when Growski talked about, you know, a discharge into a wetland area? Are we going to be allowing an exception so that development can happen that winds up becoming detrimental to a wetland somewhere else?
Well, just to touch base on that, a couple things is that the reason why, you know, we're limiting this to the HUC 14. Now, the HUC 11 was chosen if a HUC 14 project couldn't be identified, basically to keep it within the Pinelands. We checked that with the DEP staff and they were fine with that. But now as far as discharge to wetlands, you couldn't waive all or get a variance or exception from all of our standards. It's only from the volume requirement, from the rates of runoff requirement, and from the TSS removal requirement. As far as the discharge to wetlands, we could not approve or recommend that the commission approve any development that would result in an increase in rates of runoff or volume to wetlands. So that's not even on the table. That would not be something that somebody could apply or propose an exception for. Really what this standard could do, and in the case of what Ed was speaking of, is if the township decided to go through with the proposal and maybe some of the recommendations that the commission staff had, it would have actually resulted in a better outcome for the wetlands, because we were proposing that they take a bad situation, a pre-existing situation where there was a significant amount of runoff and pollutants to a wetland, and creating measures that would reduce that pollutant load into the wetland. So really it can be used and is meant to be used as a way of improving a bad situation. So the development on site that would be subject of the application in no way would be recommended for approval if it resulted in negative impacts on the wetlands, specifically with the rates of runoff and volume into the wetlands. But we would see this as continuing the current policy of being able to use the standard to make a situation better for that wetland in which, or wetland or stream where the project is situated. So it's not, improving the situation across the Pinelands, but something that's much more localized.
Well, okay, I hear you, Brian, but I'm curious. Can you point me to language in this amendment that's, will allow an exception for the discharge of your groundwater off of your, I'm sorry, not groundwater, your stormwater off site. However, it must meet these criteria. I mean, where do we see that?
Chapter 7.
That's
All other
7.
standards have to, isn't it chapter 7, the environmental standards, Chuck? Or is it 6? 6.
We'll check that, Mark. That's one of the things that we'll make sure when we go back through the draft amendments very carefully. We will make sure that either that standard needs to be explicitly stated, or if it's adopted by referencing the DEP rule, we'll figure that out to make sure it's clear.
All right, thank you.
Brian, can I ask you a question? I mean, we've had the mitigation, for want of a better word, standards in the CMP since 2006. Can you tell off the top of your head how many times we've actually approved a project that has offsite mitigation? I think the number is going to be pretty small, but do you have a general idea of how often?
I don't even think a handful of times.
Yeah, it's very rare. Very rare.
And in most cases, we are able to solve the issues on site. Even one of the biggest challenges that we have currently is with linear development. Like if the DOT wants to, work and do some road work, some road widening. But even in those cases, which are more challenging because, you do get roads through wetlands and they've been there for 100 years, we are able to solve those issues on site and improve the conditions of the wetlands. But it really very rarely, and maybe Chuck or Ernie can think of some, but it's hard. I can't really even think of many, actually any really.
And it's primarily when it involves the expansion of some existing or even pre-existing development. That's where we typically run into the situation. It's not somebody's proposing a new commercial building on a vacant site and wants to do offsite mitigation. It's really to wrestle with these tricky situations where you have existing development of some sort that needs to expand or change in some way. And that's where we do run into sometimes a struggle meeting all of the standards on site. But again, it's not something that's invoked very often.
Yeah, I do think the only one I can actually think of is with Egg Harbor City, where they wanted to pave some areas or they did a parking lot transit for the transit station there. And in order to meet that, they had to remove, and they proposed to remove an equal amount of impervious surfaces that directly discharge to wetlands. So that's really one of the only cases that I can think of where this has happened.
And for public development, all of that would be subject to direct approval by the commission. So in a case like Brian's describing, or municipal recreation fields that Ed described, all of that would be the subject of a public development approval by the commission. So you would have the opportunity to review that and make sure that you were satisfied that all the standards were met.
So does this,
what would the showing need to be by the developer to demonstrate that that it could not mitigate on site? In other words, what are the criteria that the commission would use to evaluate and agree with the developer it can't be done off site to allow it off site?
Commissioner Lloyd, Chuck Horner, just a couple of observations on that question. The typical application of the existing mitigation standard in the CMP occurs for public development applications for roads and bridges where they're physically constrained that they can't accommodate the stormwater in the immediate vicinity. And that physical constraint can be either because they simply don't own any additional land outside of the right of way that they're the right of way is so developed right up to the edge. There could be wetlands along the edge of the paved surface within the right of way. And occasionally we encounter this where the depth of the seasonal high water table is so high on a parcel. Generally, if you're within 18 inches of the surface, you're a wetlands in the Pinelands. So if someone's proposing, be it public or private development, and they need to install some type of stormwater retention facilities, and they have a seasonal high water table of perhaps 24 inches, they're not getting the separation that's also required by our rules between the bottom of the infiltration facility, basin, trench, and the seasonal high water table. So those are the most typical examples we see. Did that help?
It did help. Are those examples written into the regs though, so that, if there's not, if there's not available mitigation on site because of the bedrock, or if there are physical constraints? I mean, that's what I'm saying. What are the criteria that a developer would have to meet? What criteria would we use to agree that it can't be done on site, therefore we need to look off site? You've described two of them. I wonder if there are other ones and if they're written into the regs.
Well, can I just state that the DEP regulations here say that the applicant has to demonstrate that it's technically impracticable to meet one or more of the standards. So for the purpose of this analysis, it only can show to exist when the design performance standards can't be met for engineering, environmental, or safety reasons. So it's not completely specific, but honestly, our staff, if somebody can meet stormwater on site, we would not either recommend that they do it off site as a recommendation of approval from the commission, or same thing with private development. So if we know that it can be met on site, which in most cases it can, they couldn't invoke this variance because they would just have to show they meet their standards on site.
So are we incorporating DEP standards into our regs?
That's what the recommendation is, yes. With our modifications as far as the location of it, being in the Huck 14 or within the Pinelands. So that's the recommendation.
Thank you.
Chuck or Ed, does this standard apply to public linear development? I didn't catch that.
No, actually, in the next slide or two more slides, we'll get to public linear. So the slides that we've been looking at right now for municipal variances and for commission exceptions are just for private development or public non-linear projects.
I would just add that I'm not sure that it matters that this occur in the same municipality. There are a number of municipalities where boundaries come together. Jackson, Manchester, and Toms River all have a similar regional growth area that if you were going to develop, you might have the parcel in two towns, for instance. So I don't know that the same municipality is a issue as long as it's the same watershed. I agree with the same watershed.
Watershed, yes, I agree with that, Commissioner.
That's it.
Okay, well, I guess we'll just keep moving. And Susan, I don't know if you want to kind of bring up whether we want to adopt the change to not limit it to the same municipality later, or if you want to address that now, or.
Well, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about that, and I mean, I would agree, Alan, with what you just said, and Mark as well, that the important feature here is that if in those rare instances where offsite mitigation is going to be allowed, that it be done in the Pinelands area and in the same watershed. The municipal boundaries can be somewhat artificial, as you've mentioned. That's really not, particularly for a public development project where it might be the county or the state proposing development. The municipal boundary really is nowhere near as important. And I think if we have the other limitations, where Pinelands area and the same watershed, that will really focus and make sure that the commission's concerns are covered. So I would agree that we really don't need to have this limitation to the same municipality. I think we should get rid of that.
Me too.
Okay, so if you want to move on to the next slide, this is just one last condition. For granting a municipal variance, there can be no decrease in total volume of stormwater required to be infiltrated. So this is more stringent than what DEP requires, but we wanted to be clear about that.
And just the reason for including this is because we reference the variances in the DEP regulations, which are groundwater recharge, rates of runoff, and water quality. The recharge standard by the DEP's requirements is much less, which is it's that water quality storm that Ed had spoken about earlier. And your regulations under the CMP have always required, well, mostly always required, and at least since the mid 90s, that the total volume of the 10-year storm for all new impervious surfaces be retained and infiltrated on site. So this standard was really just to make sure that if somebody was going to be proposing an offsite mitigation measure as per the DEP regulations, which they allow and we are proposing to incorporate, that it is clear that our 10-year volume recharge standard is still the requirement, that they cannot just point to the water quality storm of the DEP regulations. So this really just supplements and further, clarifies what we require.
Brian, I've got a question on that point, and I'm harking back to Commissioner Masai was speaking to us about what the PACT team was doing and identifying increases in rainfall that are anticipated in our state in future years. Have we changed the definition of the 10-year storm in view of these increasing rainfalls? Has the DEP done that?
Can I address that?
Please.
So we went through an exercise based upon what we heard DEP tell us, and that was that data that was collected in New York State, including a few sampling stations in northern New Jersey, indicates that current rainfall and future rainfall is likely to increase, and that by about 30%, so that today's 25-year storm event may be reclassified to represent the 10-year storm event. So we considered dropping our requirement for infiltrating the volume from the 10-year storm, and instead requiring infiltration of the 25-year storm. Now, before we did that, we consulted DEP, and we learned through a former Pinelands Commission scientist, Nick Procopio, that DEP has commissioned a project that's ongoing right now, where they've enlisted, he's spoken to us before, Dave Robinson, our state climatologist representing Rutgers, and a climate scientist from Cornell University have assembled a team, and they're going to look at rainfall data that will bring us up to current rainfall totals represented as we see them today, because NOAA Atlas 14, which is what we use to define the 10-year storm event right now, represents data that was 20 years old. So the first thing they're going to do is bring us up to current, and they're also going to apply climate models to project us into the future. And we decided, rather than incorporating a 30% increase going from the 10-year storm to the 25-year storm, it would be in our interest to wait for DEP to finish the work that's being presented to them by Cornell and Rutgers. Dr. Procopio tells me that that work is anticipated to be received in late spring or early summer. And so we thought that it would be wise, rather than for us to jump ahead of those results, to wait for the science to catch up with the policy, and we will revisit that issue. In actuality, in more likelihood, DEP is going to revisit the issue. And because we've adopted that portion of DEP standard, when DEP makes the change based upon this Rutgers Cornell study, it will automatically be reflected in our rules. DEP is looking at it. It's a serious matter. They've rushed this project to get it done. And we just felt it didn't make sense for us to get ahead of that scientific study.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm glad it's being taken into consideration because I think that's going to make for a very significant change. We should probably be talking about looking at 5-year storm, some sort of event like that, based on the what we're anticipating is going to be happening with rainfall in the near future. So anyway, thank you, Ed.
Okay, so yeah, we did have a lot of conversation about what Ed just described and decided it would be best to wait and not jump the gun, knowing that DEP was doing this study.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next slide, Paul, this is really the last substantive slide about the rule changes. So this takes us to the public linear projects that we've been talking about, like roads. The rule will allow the commission to be able to grant exceptions for those projects that can't meet the stormwater standards on site. And again, just like with the variances that we've been talking about for offsite mitigation for private development and nonlinear public projects, we're proposing to adopt DEP's rule that allows what they call a waiver of strict compliance, what we would call exceptions, for these public linear projects like the enlargement of an existing road. Now, the application, again, has to meet certain conditions that are spelled out in DEP's rule, but we like the specificity that is in DEP's new rule. That is why we're proposing to adopt their standards for granting these kinds of exceptions.
I apologize. This is the first time that I'm seeing this, as being a new member of the committee. But could somebody tell me what NJAC 7:8-5.2E is?
So that's DEP's new rule, new stormwater rule. That specific provision is the one that addresses these exceptions for for linear public projects. In an earlier slide, we talked about adopting DEP's rule for the nonlinear projects and private development. That's a separate rule. 5.2E is DEP's rule for these public linear projects.
Do I have that somewhere that I can read that?
We can
Alan, I can read it right now if you'd like.
Is it brief? I don't want to prolong this.
It's not too long.
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple paragraphs. It says a waiver from strict compliance from the green infrastructure, groundwater recharge, stormwater runoff quality, and stormwater runoff quality standards may be obtained for the enlargement of an existing public roadway or railroad, the construction or enlargement of a public pedestrian access, provided that the following conditions are met. The applicant needs to demonstrate there's a public need for the project that cannot be accomplished by other means. The applicant demonstrates through an alternative analysis and through the use of stormwater management measures, the option selected complies with other requirements of DEP's rules. And this is key relative to these public projects. The applicant demonstrates that in order to meet the requirements, existing structures currently in use, such as homes or buildings, would need to be condemned. And the applicant demonstrates that it does not own land or have other rights to areas, including the potential to obtain through condemnation lands not falling under 3A above within the upstream drainage area. So there's very strict, and we could send you this so you can look at it in more detail and study it. But there's very strict limits that are being applied to these public linear projects. The emphasis is if the public project can move forward and meet the standards, it has to, but the applicant has a pretty steep burden to demonstrate that they can't meet the standard and gain these waivers. And it pretty much relates to the need to condemn existing structures that are in use.
Okay, I understand. If somebody could scan that and send it to me later, I would appreciate that.
Certainly.
Yeah, that seems like it would be very limited, the number of projects we might see that would fall under that exception, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Green Bank Bridge.
Ah,
Could be.
And actually, this was something that we had discussed that
Did that require condemnation?
Yeah, because the house exists right across from the abutment, as I understand it, as I recall.
Okay.
So that is a summary of the major changes. I do have a couple more slides, but there's one more minor changes to the draft that we sent you that I just wanted to point out. It's not a big one, but there's a section in the current CMP that requires post-construction testing to show that the stormwater management measures that were constructed, that they're performing the way they were designed to perform. We're not proposing to change that, but we did realize that we need to clarify that those post-construction requirements would not apply to minor residential. So this slide we actually showed you in September. It's the areas where the CMP would exceed DEP standards under the changes that we just went through. And again, I'll just summarize them even though we've talked about them. So for these new additions, we would require stormwater management for more development, for all minor residential development and some minor non-residential development. In most cases, these changes will result in a much larger amount of stormwater being retained and infiltrated than in the DEP rules. More stringent conditions for the offsite recharge of stormwater and more stringent recharge standard for nitrogen removal. That was the 65% requirement that Ed discussed.
Yeah.
Currently, we're already more stringent than DEP in a number of areas through prior changes to the stormwater management provisions. As Ed was talking about before, we already have a more stringent recharge requirement with using the 10-year rule, 10-year volume than the 10-year storm volume than DEP does. And I think this came up even in the mitigation discussion. We have a prohibition on discharging stormwater into wetlands and streams. So we just need to make sure, like you raised in the conversation in mitigation, that prohibition would still apply to any offsite stormwater management measures approved. We require special treatment of runoff from high pollutant areas. And as we also talked about, we have an emphasis on soil testing and as-built certification that we were kind of ahead of the curve on. So I think Ed said DEP is kind of caught up with the soil testing. So that's, we're kind of proud that we're looking out for the Pinelands and would be imposing more stringent standards. The timeline, Paul, you can go to the next slide. The timeline for getting this rule proposal through, as you, I'm sure, remember from experience, it's not a quick process. This is the timeline we're looking at, bringing it to the commission in April, filing it with OAL in April, having a public hearing in June. It takes us through basically to, bringing it back to the commission in September and then filing it with OAL, the final rule adoption in September. So we're looking at, if, all goes according to plan, the amendments taking effect in October.
6 months.
Right, and obviously the schedule could change. The schedule could change depending on, if we go ahead with the proposal and we have the hearing and a 60-day comment period and we receive thousands of public comments as DEP did, obviously there will be a delay in processing and responding to all of those and may take some additional time before we proceeded with adoption. I'm not necessarily anticipating that volume of comment, but it is one of the possibilities. We could receive a lot of questions and comments and concerns during the comment period that will take some additional time to respond to. So there are definitely points along the way where there might be a delay, but we did want to show you just to emphasize the length of the process, even if all goes well, and ask you to all to remember too that, the Pinelands municipalities are under an obligation to adopt ordinances in response to DEP's rules this by early March. So we have a lot of them doing that. There is a concern for the municipalities and for applicants about what to do in the Pinelands area in the meantime. And so I think it's in everyone's best interest to hopefully proceed with these rules and amendments and get them done by October. So there will be less of a gap period between the DEP rules being in effect and the CMP lagging a little bit behind in terms of getting everything up to speed on that. So there's going to be some period of confusion for developers and applicants and municipalities, and we'd like to shorten that as much as possible. So.
Susan, it's Rick. Is the P&I committee going to see the draft another time before it goes before the commission?
Yeah. Yeah. So our hope is at your March meeting, so next month,
okay,
we will have an updated final draft of the rules, as well as the rule proposal, the description, all the impact statements that go at the front part of a formal proposal. So you'll get to see that whole package in March.
Okay, thank you.
So in the meantime, if you have questions or concerns and you want to, email us and ask, or like Alan wanted to see portions of the DEP rule, if there's anything like that you want to be looking at in the meantime, please let us know.
Question. On the draft that was sent, page 2, paragraph 1, stormwater runoff rates and volume shall be calculated in accordance with NJAC 7:8-5.7, except that the rationale method for peak flow, modified rationale method for hydrograph shall not be used. What's the background for not using the rationale method?
We've actually never permitted that, and in the current regulation, it does not permit the use of the rational method. So this was just to continue what we already don't require. And
so help me, why was it never included?
I think because I wasn't involved in that original. I mean, I think that's been a holdover since at least 1995. And I do actually, and Ed, you might recall this, the DEP, I think, is in the process of also not drafting regulations to no longer permit those as well. So we thought we could just refer to the DEP section, then permit it, and then not permit it when they said, when they made those rule changes that they're in the process of doing. But we just felt that it was important to hold over our current regulation and not to change that without some significant thought.
In looking at the DEP regs presently as proposed, the rationale method is not eliminated from use.
That is correct. No, and those are not, the DEP regulations are not proposed, they're in effect, but having gone to some stakeholder meetings to talk about other regulations, they are considering and going to propose, I'm not sure what their time frame is, but in their next go around, which is going to be sooner than later, that the rational method not be usable. That's one of their things that they're currently working on. So you're correct in that right now and previously they've allowed that, but they are seriously considering not allowing it.
So would we be better off just stopping the sentence at the end of NJAC 7:8-5.7 period, so that if 5.7 changes, we're covered?
Well, we didn't want a gap between when our rules are adopted and DEP's. It's possible that DEP won't get to changing that until after our rules are adopted. So just, in preparation and just to be safe, we thought it would be better to keep the language in.
Okay, are there Are there any more questions, or are we finished with the
No.
presentation?
Rick, I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
I didn't know, I could hear something in the background. I wasn't sure I was still connected. Has there been any, obviously, the more volume that's stored on a parcel, the less volume or the less land is available for development. Have we given any thought to how much land we're taking, particularly in the regional growth areas, out of consideration for development because we're using it for stormwater controls? Basins are bigger, there's more restricted area for swales, et cetera, et cetera.
Alan, this is Ed. I can say that I've never been involved in that type of analysis.
Okay. All right.
And it does
Rick,
that we're not-
Avery?
Alan, you think you can anticipate protests from major developers?
Pardon me?
Cutting back on.
I couldn't hear you, Commissioner.
I'm saying, I'm asking whether you're anticipating as a result of your point that we can anticipate serious opposition from developers in the state, that they'll look at this and say, you're confiscating available development land.
I'm not really too concerned about that, Mark, but the development potential of the regional growth areas ties directly to the PDC program and other programs, affordable housing programs. And I just was curious if we've thought about, you know, some of the unforeseen impacts that, and I don't have a problem with these stormwater rules. Understand that. I'm just raising that as a question. If anybody, you know, I looked at the state model. I read the state model ordinance, for instance, and I think I mentioned this to Director Grogan, the basins are required to have a safety ledge. Well, that's good. And I understand that. It's very similar to our resource extraction requirements, except that it takes away storage volume. So it pushes the total dimensions of the basin to a larger size. And it doesn't take long to, you know, all you have on your site is stormwater control. And I just raised that as a thought. I don't know that it'll ever be a real problem for the commission or for the programs that are associated with the development side of the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan.
Yeah.
My other,
raised very good
Commissioner?
points.
yes.
I would just say from my personal experience that yes, you are correct that area for development would be significantly reduced regarding implementation of green infrastructure, green solutions, the ledge, and the fact that you need to have 1 foot of freeboard on retention basins. So yes, the developmental situation will be reduced.
I would just like to add, actually, with the ledge that you mentioned, that's always been a requirement of the DEPs for safety purposes. So that's not a new requirement from the DEP regulations. And as far as the volume requirement, we're really not changing the volume requirement, especially with major development. We're adding a volume requirement for minor development. However, we haven't foreseen that adding some dry wells for roof runoff in a minor residential development is going to impact and reduce the developable area, since really the dry wells are just going to be going next to the house anyway in a lawn area. It's not reducing not having an impact on that overall development area. So with the green infrastructure, the DEP is requiring multiple smaller basins now throughout the site. However, that is already a Pinelands requirement. While it's in the commission's CMP, it's not clarified on how to achieve that, but we already do require multiple smaller measures throughout a site. So I don't anticipate that it's going to have, and obviously, you know, I'm sure there's some situation where it is going to impact the site, but we're not changing our 10-year volume requirement. And in fact, a person or a developer, a design engineer can use that green infrastructure as part of meeting our 10-year volume requirement. So while it will result in additional measures to the site, which is already required by the CMP. That's not a volume that's going to be required on top of our volume requirement. They could use those, the volume that's retained, say, bioretention swales throughout the site as part of meeting our 10-year volume requirement, which could then result in a smaller basins for infiltration.
If I can elaborate on that. So Commissioner Avery, that Brian brings up a good point. So if you have a creative designer that incorporates green infrastructure, so they're going to use dry wells on individual parcels. So you're going to take some water that would end up in a basin and recharge it right on the site. A creative designer could use permeable pavement, and permeable pavement is going to serve two purposes, right? It's going to be built infrastructure, but it's also going to be stormwater management infrastructure, and therefore eliminate some of the water that goes to a basin. A rain garden similarly can do two purposes. You know, it can be an aesthetic feature on a property. At the same time, it can serve stormwater management purposes. So if we get landscape architects and engineers that apply creative design to these projects, they may be able to limit the size of those large, obvious surface features like infiltration facilities by using these smaller facilities and getting two purposes out of the same thing.
Yeah, I understand that. The other question I had was, if DEP changes based on the rainfall study that you referenced, if they change their storm requirements based on the result of that study, do they have to promulgate that through the Administrative Procedures Act, or can they just arbitrarily change it?
Well,
as they sometimes like to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a question best answered by Susan.
Director?
Well, I'm going to say that I don't think they can arbitrarily change anything, but
You've never been an applicant.
but we will confirm with them what their process would be for that and other changes to their rules, because obviously, you know, if they're doing it through a rule change, that's one thing, and we'll have the opportunity to review and comment on that, as will the public. If they're simply able to do it by adoption of a new BMP chapter, I'm not sure exactly how it will work, but we'll confirm with them how their process would play out.
I just want there to be some kind of a process.
Probably it would by them modifying the rainfall curve data. For instance, the 10-year storm, instead of being 5 inches, might be 6 1/4 inches.
Well, I understand that, Commissioner. I just wonder, you know, if you could change the rainfall curve, or I use the word arbitrarily, but without going through a regulatory rule proposal, is my concern. That there's some process, since we are now as a commission adopting that standard as well. So
we'll confirm with DEP what process they envision following, just to be sure we're comfortable with it.
And my final question, Sue, in the model ordinance, are we sure that the application of that ordinance to farm and farm-related improvements are consistent with our standards regarding agriculture? Do you understand what I'm saying? Poorly.
So you're saying there's something in DEP's model stormwater ordinance that speaks to agriculture related development?
I thought that there was.
Okay.
Could you check that and make sure it's consistent?
We will check. Yep.
All right. I think it's more in terms of the, you know, processing and structures than it is than the, you know, grown crops and livestock and that kind of thing. It's that more of a structural issue. If you ever going to have a facility to process cranberries or something like that,
right?
You know what
I mean? We'll check.
I have a question for Edwin Growski. If I could go back, Ed, to that nitrogen loading regulation that seems like a tough hurdle to meet. I mean, I'm all for it, but I'm wondering, is the DEP looking into, or should we be looking whether or not we should perhaps restrict the application of these nitrogen fertilizers, in some way regulate them. So we're trying to avoid the problem rather than trying to deal with it once stormwater has mingled with these fertilizers.
Well, that's a great question, and it will definitely require developers to, as a general rule, string multiple BMPs together to get to that 65%. I will tell you that DEP was very supportive. They thought that it was a great idea. They haven't taken the step to do it, but they commended us for doing so. With respect to fertilizers, so there was some fertilizer laws that were revised in the last 6 or 7 years that now require a minimum percentage of organic nitrogen to be contained in fertilizer. So organic nitrogen is a slow release compound as opposed to the synthesized nitrogens. The inorganic nitrogen, when it rains, it dissolves immediately and can quickly move past the root zone and get into the water table. The organic nitrogen is a slower breaking down nitrogen product. So it's kind of slow release. It gets released at a rate that's somewhat consistent with the ability of the vegetation to take it up. So the state has adopted rules to try and get to that. They've also, although, it's a difficult thing to enforce, imposed seasonal application standards for nitrogen. You're not permitted to apply nitrogen past a certain calendar month when the plants aren't growing, for example, because it's recognized that nitrogen basically simply washes off the landscape. So, it's one of those things where the commercial landscapers are no doubt, I suspect, abiding by that rule. Homeowners may not. But the nitrogen problem has been tackled at the fertilizer level by those two mechanisms: increased organic content and seasonal application rates. The 65% removal, we expect we probably will get some pushback on that. In Marcy's initial slide, she said that we were trying to adopt standards that were could be reasonably met by the development community. We looked at how that 65% standard could be met. We think it can be done so reasonably. We think the benefit outweighs the additional burden on the development community, but we'll have to address that certainly with additional backup during the public comment period, I suspect.
Thanks very much, Ed. Appreciate it.
They've also removed phosphorus from some of the fertilizers.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Any more questions?
Before we leave the discussion, so Commissioner Avery asked us to send him a section of the DEP rule 5.2E. I will say that Marcy spared us all tremendous technical detail that's contained in DEP's rules. There's pages and pages of technical detail in those rules. We adopt them by reference. So we have like one line in the CMP that says we adopt 4.6, chapter 5 and 6. If anybody's interested in getting a copy of those full DEP rules, they're available online through a DEP website. We can send that link to all the commissioners. It's tremendously technical reading, but if anybody wants to dive into it, it is available online.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay, anything else? All right, on behalf of the commission, I'd like to thank Brian and Ed and Marcy and Stacy and Nancy and Chuck, and hope I didn't leave anybody out in working on these amendments.
Bravo.
You certainly filled in a lot of the areas that I didn't even think about. So, anybody else going to say anything at this point? Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the overview of the redevelopment in the Pinelands area, and I understand Susan and Brad are going to do this presentation. So welcome again, Susan and Brad.
Hello, commissioners. I have a presentation that I'm going to attempt to share. So let me get this started. All right, now. Let's see. I'm gonna Apologies for the delay.
While we're struggling with technology, I'll point out that Commissioner Irick has raised issues about redevelopment several times over some amount of time. So we're finally getting to an overview discussion of it.
Thank you, Nancy.
We didn't just dream this one up.
So just a quick question. Is there a slideshow now starting?
No.
No,
Not
no,
on my
wait,
screen.
Not yet.
There's a dog.
Oh, no, no.
it's be a dog.
Ha.
So Brad, it takes a couple moments, I've noticed.
So I'm sorry, but is there anything on my screen that's being shared right now?
No.
You are.
Hey,
That's
is
a dog.
There's the dog again.
that a Dogecoin reference?
It's
Brad,
gonna take a minute, Brad, with the technical issues of Verizon.
Yeah, keep the faith. I had the same issues. It will eventually show up. So keep trying.
Just like to
And
remind.
take the opportunity to congratulate the team on the byway designation. Congratulations all. Great work.
Very good
Great.
news.
We're getting great press.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind the public, we're going to have public comment after two topics are discussed. You need to call in and plug in the identification number for this meeting. Probably about 20 minutes, we'll have public comment.
You're an optimist.
Mm.
Let's see. I'll set my stopwatch, see how close I am.
There it is.
Sorry.
Oh man. Oh.
That's called
Okay.
flop sweat, Brad.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're seeing a presentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. And I like to think that I'm okay with technology. I was about to have a major embarrassment. Okay. All right. Good morning, commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about redevelopment in the Pinelands today. I wanted to start off by saying that, after this meeting's over, this slide deck is going to be available to you all. I say that because there's going to be some slides with a lot of text that I've taken from state statutes. So please don't feel compelled to read it all as we go along. But you might see that there's some benefit to actually seeing some of the text and not me just trying to give an abridged version. So Susan's probably going to jump in throughout, but the general outline, and you all can ask questions along the way. It's going to start with an overview of the redevelopment process in New Jersey, and then a summary of redevelopment in the Pinelands area and the role of the commission. And then at the end, I'm going to give some examples of certified redevelopment plans. To start off, what is redevelopment? It's a process to rebuild or restore an area in a measurable state of decline, disinvestment, or abandonment. So redevelopment may be publicly or privately initiated, but in the New Jersey context, it's commonly recognized as the process governed by the local redevelopment and housing law, and undertaken in accordance with a redevelopment plan adopted by a municipality. So, this comes out of a handbook that specifically was made by published by the New Jersey APA on redevelopment. And, just a couple of things to note is that to keep in mind that, redevelopment can occur simply in the marketplace without government intervention, utilizing existing, normal zoning and land development regulations permitted by the municipal land use law. However, in many instances, government intervention is needed to make the economics work for redevelopment in certain areas. So the law itself was adopted in 1992 and has since been amended. The law consolidated and updated a few different prior urban renewal statutes from the 1950s. Generally, it enables municipalities to undertake redevelopment and provides enhanced tools for them to effectuate redevelopment. We'll get into those momentarily. So I just want to say at the outset is that this law and its various applications are very complex. Details provided here are really tailored to municipally led redevelopment that's common in the Pinelands. So, I just want to say that, how redevelopment is carried out in Camden versus Trenton versus all those densely populated areas in northern New Jersey is very different than what we're seeing in the Pinelands. So generally the way the law works is that, it defines the roles of the governing body of the municipality, the planning board, the redevelopment entity. It defines the criteria for how areas meet the standards for being designated areas in need of redevelopment or in need of rehabilitation. It describes the contents required in a redevelopment plan and establishes the powers of the redevelopment entity to implement the plan. So redevelopment entity is almost always the governing body of the municipality in the Pinelands. However, the law allows for the governing body to give those responsibilities to a public entity such as a housing authority or a redevelopment authority. So again, we don't really see that in the Pinelands so much. Again, the statute contains a lot more detail here, but these are the most sort of relevant to this presentation. So this slide here kind of outlines the typical redevelopment process. The top is generally the process that's undertaken throughout the state. And the bottom half sort of explains what the Pinelands Commission's role is for areas within the Pinelands area. So to start out, so I have a laser pointer.
Ooh,
So, so to start out, the municipal governing body generally identifies an area that they feel could meet the criteria of a redevelopment area or a rehabilitation area. They would then, by resolution, request that the planning board conduct a preliminary investigation into whether the area delineated meets the statutory requirements to be designated as such. And we'll get into what those requirements look like momentarily. Planning board does its investigation, holds a public hearing, and makes a recommendation to the municipal governing body. The governing body then decides whether to designate a redevelopment area. If they do so, they have to send the resolution that adopts that designation to the Department of Community Affairs for review. Oops, sorry. So the DCA reviews, well, I'll come back to that momentarily. So municipal governing body designates an area in need of redevelopment or rehabilitation. The next step is that the municipality would prepare and adopt a redevelopment plan that effectuates the redevelopment for that location. That's adopted by ordinance. And then the final step would be that the municipality implements the redevelopment plan. That's, as I said, the governing body is usually the redevelopment entity in the Pinelands area. They have various tools to work with after the redevelopment plan is adopted, such as entering into redeveloper agreements with private redevelopers, using various financial instruments and agreements. But any sort of development that would be proposed would then go before the municipal planning board for review. Now, in the Pinelands area, the commission can be consulted at any time prior to the adoption of the redevelopment plan by ordinance. So some municipalities have come to us pretty far in advance of their designation to sort of, to sort of do a pre-consultation on any issues that might arise or what they're thinking in terms of what, they were envisioning for the area. Other times we may not hear about, an effort to create adopt a redevelopment plan until it's already been introduced by ordinance or even adopted. So we generally, whenever we have the opportunity, we always recommend to municipalities to, consult with us as early in the process as possible so that, they can get ahead of any potential issues that, might arise from what they're envisioning. So one way that we do sort of get an early sort of warning notice is that, when a municipality designates an area in need of rehabilitation or redevelopment, they're required to send the resolution to the Department of Community Affairs. DCA reviews the designations to determine whether the area designated is situated in an area in which development or redevelopment is to be encouraged pursuant to any state law or regulation. So in this example, the staff that review these at DCA, when they look to see, is it located in the Pinelands area, they generally, reach out to us and, ask us, is there any concerns? Is this, is it in an area that, development or redevelopment is to be encouraged? This review requirement by DCA only came about in 2003. So it's relatively speaking, in the history of redevelopment in New Jersey, it's relatively new. And, in terms of our relationship, working with DCA on these things, it's definitely strengthened over the years as redevelopment has become a lot more popular tool used by municipalities. So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the Commission's reviews of adopted redevelopment plans and our certification process. And then, after we certify a redevelopment plan, again, just as, the redeveloper would have to apply to the planning board, that application would have to come to the Commission first, just as any other development application would. So moving along. Oh, I should just mention real quick that that in terms of DCA sort of rejecting a designation, it really does not happen frequently. But I just wanted to note that just recently, a denial occurred for a designation made in Franklin Township in Warren County. So that's outside the Pinelands area. It's in northern New Jersey. The municipality included in the designated redevelopment area a 100+ acre tract of prime farmland that was in active use. In this case, DCA's determination was based on, reviewing the state's planning area designations from the state development redevelopment plan. It was in planning area 4B, which is a rural environmentally sensitive area. And they also looked at the municipalities, I believe their farmland protection plan. And so, the statute's pretty broad in how they're supposed to determine whether it's an area to be encouraged for development and redevelopment. They can draw upon a lot of different resources. So, in the Pinelands area, they can look at our Pinelands management areas. So moving on. So during that preliminary investigation that the planning board conducts for an area in need of redevelopment, they look at the statutes, and there's about 9 different criteria, and any one of which, if it's found, gives the municipality to designate the area as an area in need of redevelopment. Now, this is where, a lot of the text on the slides, I'm not going to, read all of it. But there's a lot of, I guess the takeaway is that there's a lot of different ways in which a municipality can look at a delineated area and arrive at the conclusion that it's an area in need of redevelopment. So they can look at what is the standard, the conditions of the buildings, vacancy, is it land that's remained unimproved for a number of years, areas in which there's some sort of buildings which are detrimental to the safety, health, and morals of the community, issues with assembling various parcels due to outstanding issues with titles. And so really there's a wide range from which these criteria can be pulled upon to make the designation. Now, I'll just move on. So there is a difference between designating an area in need of redevelopment versus an area in need of rehabilitation. So the area in need of rehabilitation, there's 6 criteria which are listed on this slide, and they're much easier to meet. They're a little broader. An example here is that, in an area, if more than half of the housing stock in the delineated area is at least 50 years old, it qualifies. So, I mean, that's something we've seen in a number of cases, because that's data that's pretty well available to municipalities. And I'll get into the distinction between redevelopment area versus rehabilitation area in just a moment. So moving on, after the designation, the municipality then moves on to preparing a redevelopment plan. The statutes explain what needs to be in the redevelopment plan. It needs to include relationship to local planning objectives, proposed land uses and building requirements in the project area, identification of property within the redevelopment area which is proposed to be acquired, and that could be through eminent domain or condemnation. Its relationship to statewide plans, county plans, local plans, adjacent municipalities plans, and then relationship to the municipal land use law. So the ones that we really look at when we get a redevelopment plan that's been adopted and we are reviewing it at the commission, we're really focusing on what is going on with the proposed land uses and building requirements in the project area. And then, are generally, is there mention of the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan, as a, one of these additional plans that, sort of ties into the relationship. So I'll talk a little bit more about, the criteria for what we see. Well, actually, what I can say is that the redevelopment plan has the ability to supersede applicable provisions of the municipality's zoning regulations. They can create overlay zoning districts, and that allows municipalities to establish permitted uses, bulk, and design standards that aren't permitted in the underlying zoning. Alternatively, we've also seen that oftentimes redevelopment plans simply adopt the underlying zoning requirements and don't really change it, or maybe tweak it just a little with maybe, say, building design standards or landscaping standards. But in any case, anything that gets adopted in the Pinelands area needs to meet our requirements. So, it's not this is not an exemption from, our requirements for what needs to be in the land development ordinance. So an important thing to note is that in effectuating a redevelopment plan, one of the, most powerful tools at the disposal of municipalities is the tools they have, the financial tools of long-term tax exemptions and 5-year exemption and abatements. So in some instances, these tools are really the main thing driving municipalities in designating redevelopment areas. Again, these are really complex tools with a lot of pros and cons and critiques and how they've been used statewide. But again, they are tools that really can help with the economic viability of redeveloping certain problematic areas such as brownfields, landfills, areas with contamination, where economics are really hard. So there are 2 primary statutes for two different programs. One is the long-term tax exemption law, and one is the 5-year exemption and abatement law. The long-term tax exemption law is relatively more complex given the flexibility provided by the law. The longer time horizons, since it allows up to 30 years of exemption, so a lot of the initial financial analysis at the upfront takes in a lot of assumptions over a very long time horizon. And it's something that's negotiated between a municipality and a redeveloper. So, there's room for negotiation within the confines of what the law allows. So again, the main takeaway is that it would exempt the value of the new improvements that are constructed as part of a redevelopment project. It's in a financial agreement with a particular urban renewal entity, which has to be, has limited profit making abilities, has special incorporation requirements. And in lieu of paying taxes, there's what's called an annual service charge, also known as a pilot. So the pilot aspect is really where there's a lot of opportunity to really tailor, how, what that payment in lieu of taxes is going to look like over time. So there's different parameters of how, options that municipalities have with that. The second program is the 5-year exemption and abatement law. This is something that a municipality has to adopt an ordinance that sort of sets out the program. Again, it's got to be within the parameters of the 5-year exemption and abatement law, but it allows for many more diverse property owners to take advantage of it if they meet the criteria established by the municipality. So exemptions could be granted from property taxes on all or a portion of added assessed value for improvements. That would be the exemption component. Or there could be abatements, which may be granted from property taxes on existing assessed value of property. So again, there's a variety of ways in which towns can take advantage of this. So just important to note that when we've seen plans come in where, they really are relying on just the underlying zoning and not, changing the land development standards, usually it's to open up the opportunity to use these tools to make certain projects viable. All right, so area in need of redevelopment versus area in need of rehabilitation. So what's the distinction? So as I mentioned earlier, there's different statutory criteria for the designation. Generally speaking, it's an easier burden to prove that an area meets the criteria of being in need of rehabilitation versus being in need of redevelopment. The reason, additionally, areas in need of rehabilitation do not require a preliminary investigation from the planning board, only a non-binding review and recommendation. One of the reasons why it's an easier hurdle is that a redevelopment area gives sort of stronger, more powerful tools that municipalities work with, which require additional oversight or work with planning board and public hearings and such. So redevelopment areas, designated redevelopment areas are the only, let me rephrase this. The use of eminent domain can only be undertaken as part of an area in need of redevelopment. The long-term tax exemption may only be granted for projects within an area in need of redevelopment, the 30-year exemption. So those are two very powerful tools. That's the reason why they have stricter criteria. However, this is what can be a little confusing, is that a redevelopment plan can be adopted for a rehabilitation area. So whether you designate as redevelopment or rehabilitation area, in both instances, you can have a redevelopment plan. So now we're going to talk a little bit about more specifically the Pinelands Commission. So I just wanted to bring this slide up again. So again, really our formal review starts here after the governing body has adopted the redevelopment plan by ordinance. So at that point, the commission gets a copy of the ordinance and the redevelopment plan, and we review it as we would any other land use ordinance. We look at what's being permitted, what are the, is it, in this case, what we look for is, are they referencing the existing standards in their code that they have adopted and have been certified by the commission? There's, it's not practical to restate all of their existing code that, are requirements from the CMP in the redevelopment plan, but we ensure that those plans reference those codes as being, incorporated within. If they are somehow deviating from the permitted uses in the underlying zone that's been certified, we look at that and we ensure that it's things that we can allow for given its location and its management in the management area. And in some instances, when we're looking at the site conditions of the areas being redeveloped, we look at it, is there wetlands? Are there issues that, perhaps, there needs to be mention of in the rules within the redevelopment plan. So in this slide, I'm showing the number of currently certified redevelopment plans by Pinelands management area. So as you can see, we have a total of 56. I'll just note a couple. So the one in the Pineland or Preservation Area District is one that we recently reviewed a couple months ago. It's the Whiting Landfill Redevelopment Plan. That was the one that had to do with the plan. The goal of the plan was to cap the landfill appropriately and then develop solar. They had been awarded one of the community solar pilot program conditional approvals from the BPU. So that should be relatively familiar. The township-wide redevelopment plans, of course, are covering multiple management areas, but they're not counted in these numbers here. So they're an example where they are essentially just adopting the existing zoning plan and land development regulations in the municipal code and not changing anything at all. So they're just, it's a plan that really has to do with effectuating their tax exemption and abatement programs. So as you can see, the majority of redevelopment plans that we have adopted are in our more growth-oriented management areas, namely the regional growth area, Pinelands Town, and some in Pinelands Villages and rural development areas. Another thing to just mention is that over time, we also see amendments to redevelopment plans. So, these plans can essentially, these plans sometimes have expiration dates and sunset clauses, but sometimes they don't. And so they linger for years and years. And, sometimes an interested developer shows up and may have a vision that isn't quite in sync with the redevelopment plan that maybe is 10 years old, or maybe the community's preferences have changed. And so, you get, it makes sense that they update and amend them from time to time. So we've had an additional, maybe, in addition to the 56 ordinances, we've had probably like 20 or more amendments to those, across a variety of them. So some examples of redevelopment plans. So first we'll do a couple. So we're going to show two that are located in the regional growth area and two that are in a Pinelands Town setting. So just as a quick refresher on regional growth areas, these are areas of existing development in adjacent lands that have the infrastructure, sewers, roads, other utilities necessary to accommodate new development. Future growth is targeted to and encouraged in regional growth areas as a way of preventing scattered and piecemeal development and relieving development pressure in other more sensitive portions of the Pinelands area. Very permissive in terms of uses. It's a receiving area for the Pinelands Development Credit Program, and it takes up about 8% of the total land area within the Pinelands area. So the CMP prescribes base densities for each of the municipalities that they must accommodate through zoning. They range from 1 to 3.5 units per upland acre spread across the entire RGA, or regional growth area. CMP also requires that they accommodate bonus density through the use of PDCs with a minimum of 50% above that base density. CMP allows municipalities to zone for increased residential zoning capacity, provide additional density bonuses if certain standards are met, including sufficient infrastructure, sufficient opportunities for the use of PDCs, and that lands being upzoned are appropriate for higher intensity development. So this is one that commissioners may recall. There's been a number of amendments, one most recently in the last couple of years, and this is the Pemberton Township Browns Mill Town Center redevelopment plan. So this is an example where the township designated an area in need of redevelopment that was pretty extensive. The designation occurred in 1995, and there have been a number of amendments since then. So what you're seeing on this map right here comes from their 2018 redevelopment plan that the commission certified. And the amendment maintained the existing redevelopment area boundary, but adopted sort of a new zoning scheme that creates 4 different zones. You can sort of see up here, these are the various zones: mixed use, neighborhood, retail, waterfront. And there's, within the plan, there were updated architectural standards. In fact, this was, I want to say that the township had actually contracted with DCA to help. They had provided consulting services on this project. So, I mean, there was an extensive process to sort of relook at what the vision was for, Browns Mills. And out of that process, they came up with this new zoning plan and they adopted it in the redevelopment plan. So this is an example of a pretty big redevelopment area. So this is pretty much just summarizing what I just said. So just move on to the next one. The next one is called the Hamilton Township Landfill Redevelopment Plan. So in this case, it's, the designated area is a single lot that was a former landfill. So it was designated in 2007, redevelopment plan adopted in 2010. And it simply incorporated the existing permitted uses within the existing industrial business park zone of Hamilton Township, and with one additional use being that it would permit principal use solar energy facilities. So, the purpose of this redevelopment plan was to effectuate the capping enclosure of the landfill in accordance with DEP and CMP standards. Unfortunately, as you can see, the conditions of this aerial are where it still stands. It hasn't been capped yet, and there's no solar. Capping would have to precede the solar. But here's just to reiterate again, an example of a different application of these tools for a different type of redevelopment. Rather than a downtown area, it's a landfill. So now for the Pinelands town management area. So again, the CMP permits municipalities to zone very, very permissible with the types of uses that are permitted in the town management area, provided that the public service infrastructure necessary to support the uses available and that it's compatible with the existing structures and uses in the area. There's no minimum or maximum prescribed residential density in Pinelands town management areas. PDC program does not apply. And this management area accounts for about 2% of the land within the Pinelands area. So an example I'm going to give now is another recently adopted amendment to an existing redevelopment plan, and it's called the Borough of Wrightstown Redevelopment Plan. it's a redevelopment plan that encompasses almost the entire municipality, which only a portion of which is within the Pinelands area. So in 2020, they adopted a redevelopment plan that effectively, the amendment was specifically for the portion that was in the Pinelands area. And so what you're seeing here is it's a conceptual site plan for how the parcel was to be built out. So in this instance, it was kind of unique because while the municipality was putting together this redevelopment plan, they already were working with a developer that had a very specific plan already in mind. So in this case, the redevelopment plan actually included this site plan. And it also included these various elevations for the types of buildings, the architectural styles that were going to be permitted. So in this case, this is a pretty large development that would permit up to 440 residential units that provide a mix of single-family townhomes and apartments, up to 20,000 square feet of commercial uses, including a hotel and mixed-use buildings with residential on top of commercial. So in this example, these would be the single-family homes up here, townhouses all in this area. These would be the multifamily units, and then this would be the commercial or mixed-use buildings. So another example of a very different, application of the redevelopment planning process. So lastly, we have Manchester Township, which adopted a plan for 2121 Lake Road. This was designated in 2020. So this is going to be an example of a very quickly designated redevelopment plan adopted, development moving. So the municipality designated the area in January of 2020. They adopted a redevelopment plan in September of 2020. Here we go again. And the area is a 6.23 acre lot in the Whiting Town Office Professional Zone. The goal of the plan was to effectuate the improvement of the area, which has remained vacant and undesirable to developers for more than 10 years. That's quoting their redevelopment plan. And it simply incorporated the existing uses of the WTOP zone with the additional permitted use of mini warehouses and self-storage units. So as of now, an application, since this was reviewed by the commission and found to raise no substantial issues with respect to the CMP in September, an applicant has already filed an application with the commission and a CF was issued. So, and it was for a 45,000 square foot commercial storage facility. So this is an example of, a township was probably working with a redeveloper, during this whole redevelopment planning process. And things were, there was a plan that was pretty quickly implemented. So, again, there's a lot of varieties in which these tools can be used. And in particular, we're seeing them used differently in the Pinelands than in the rest of the state. And I guess the other big trend to just mention is that we are seeing more of them in recent years. So let me see. Let's see. So with that, I guess I'll just open it up for any questions.
Thank you for that presentation. This is Commissioner Irick, and I've raised several questions about redevelopment. And my concern with regard to redevelopment is that some redevelopment plans erode our CMP, particularly as it relates to residential units. Is there a maximum density that we permit in redevelopment plans? I see that 8% more would be, if we had 3.5 units per acre, that would be 7 units per acre. So my concern, obviously, is that whatever we're doing environmentally to protect the pinelands is eroded by granting approvals of redevelopment areas.
So a couple things, Commissioner. The 50% provision, if a municipality's density assignment were 3.5 units per acre, 50% would take them to 5.25 as their maximum assigned density. And I think the thing to remember about the regional growth areas is that the densities that Brad went through, the 1 to 3.5 and then the 50%, those are required. Those are the minimum requirements that municipalities have to zone for. It's not optional. They have to accommodate at least that level of residential development in their regional growth areas. That's what the CMP requires. And then if they want to go beyond that for various reasons, whether it's through a redevelopment plan or not, the CMP provides them that flexibility. They have to demonstrate that certain standards are met. As Brad said, infrastructure, we look for the environmental conditions in an area. If they're upzoning to permit, for example, higher density mixed use development, we're looking to see, are there wetlands? Are there other issues that might be of concern in that particular portion of the regional growth area? As you all know, because I say it at just about every meeting, we require them to accommodate real opportunities for the use of Pinelands development credits. Most often that's done now through a mandatory requirement for credit so that it's no longer optional. But if they're able to demonstrate that those standards are met, then the CMP allows them to zone their portions of their regional growth areas for these higher densities. There's no maximum cap that's in the CMP. It doesn't say, but in no case can you exceed 10 units per acre. That is not part of the rules. It is something we, of course, look at to see what they're proposing. But the CMP does provide municipalities with flexibility to move their zoning densities around, increase densities in portions of their regional growth areas if they need to in order to accommodate things like affordable housing projects. This has been critical for Pinelands municipalities to be able to implement the settlement agreements with fair share housing and provide zoning and opportunities for apartments or age-restricted apartments or assisted living facilities, many of which are called for in their affordable housing plans. They're doing it to allow for mixed-use development. We saw it in Waterford where they did a very large redevelopment area around a transit train station, to effectuate more of a transit village community, if you will, in that area. So they have a number of reasons when they propose these things. Most often we're seeing affordable housing. A lot of it's being done through redevelopment planning, but not always. Sometimes it's just an ordinance change that just create a new zone. And the CMP, does encourage and target regional growth areas for higher density residential development. That is one of the sort of main standards in the CMP and in the Pinelands Protection Act, that we're really trying to make sure that development is not only permitted, but actually occurs in the regional growth areas. That's where the higher density is focused, and in Pinelands towns to some extent. So no, there's no upper cap. I think if a municipality came in and said, we want to zone our entire regional growth area for 30 units per acre, we would probably have some concerns with that. But that hasn't happened. More often it's just one, very small area where they're looking to accommodate an apartment project or an affordable housing project at a higher density, or an assisted living facility at a higher density. They're smaller, discrete areas, so it's not upsetting or overturning their whole zoning plan. They're just small pieces. So this has been a very important tool for many of our municipalities who are seeking to accommodate the needed growth and affordable housing.
Should we consider maximum density?
In my opinion, I don't think that's necessary. We could do a study to figure out what that maximum density might be. Historically, the commission's concern has not been with maximum density in regional growth areas. It has been with minimum density in regional growth areas. All of our housing studies, we had a task force many years ago to look at this issue. And the concern really has traditionally been pushing municipalities to zone for higher density development to make sure there's more efficient use of land in the regional growth areas. Because what we don't want is low density, single family housing sprawled throughout the regional growth areas, taking up all of the land. So traditionally the commission has been encouraging and supportive of mixed use, multifamily, higher density development in the regional growth areas. So, the Housing Task Force study that I referred to, that was maybe 15 years ago now or more. More, Alan will remember, long, maybe 20 years ago now. But I mean, the whole push of that study and the recommendations there were suggestions that the commission require municipalities to zone for higher density in the regional growth areas. There was not the concern with the cap. That was the way to make sure the land got used efficiently, that projects were developed without eating up all of the land, that PDC opportunities were realistic and used for these higher density projects. And the thought was we needed to do that so that there would not be pressure once the land in the regional growth areas was developed with sprawled single family housing. We would not then get requests to expand the regional growth areas into the rural development area, for example, or the forest area, because there was a need to accommodate more growth. So I personally don't see the need to establish a cap. We could certainly look into that. I'm not quite sure how we would come up with an appropriate number. I suspect the number would have to be different in different municipalities given their existing development patterns and the zoning they already have in place. I mean, it is something we could look into, but I'm not so far seeing the need to do that because we're basically being, the towns are asking to upzone and accommodate different forms of development in some typically pretty small portions of their regional growth areas.
And I understand the need to not consume resources and try very hard to put birds of a feather together. But my concern, and I was somewhat taken aback when I learned 20 units per acre were approved. That just seems to me to be quite high.
It is a big number, absolutely. And it's rare that we see any kind of density like that. And I think the one you're referring to, Commissioner, is the redevelopment plan that Monroe Township adopted recently that the commission approved last month, where the development that will occur, presumably, is an apartment building of about 75 or 80 units on 4 acres of land. It's a portion of a small portion of a larger property. So when you do the density calculations, the number pops out at you as 20 units per acre. But in reality, it's a very tiny piece of property, and it's one project. It's one or two, perhaps one or two buildings of affordable apartments on a highway. So we do look at those things. Again, if Monroe had come in and said, we have 200 acres here and we want to zone for 20 units per acre, I think we'd have a very different reaction. But when they're looking to change a very small piece of property for a specific project that's written into their approved affordable housing plan, we do take all of that into consideration and in determining whether the density and the ultimate development potential is appropriate for the area.
Of course, once the door is open, the next request might be 25 or 30 units per acre. So I'll leave that thought.
If I could, Commissioner Irick, I think there actually are practical upper limits on development in terms of water use permitting, sewer or septic allocations. A development project can't exceed what's practical and possible to allocate for a site.
I think you're right, Commissioner. There are, we didn't emphasize this, but of course, any development at whatever density it is has to meet all of the CMP environmental standards. So we just talked about stormwater management. They're going to need to accommodate stormwater through, under the new rules, several different types of BMPs, perhaps a basin and swale. So land will be, there. So yes, there are definitely limitations. There has to be sewer capacity. So we look at infrastructure, we look at the roads, there has to be sewer capacity, water capacity. They have to be able to accommodate stormwater on site. So there are definitely going to be limitations. And then, the municipalities themselves have all kinds of other planning considerations that they have to take into account when they're doing either redevelopment planning or zoning changes. They're looking at design, they're looking at the surrounding area. The height of the buildings can be of concern if it's in, depending on what the height of existing buildings in the areas are. They're looking at a whole variety of additional limitations and considerations as well. So yeah, it's definitely a complicated process. There's a lot that goes into it.
Director, it seems to me that most of the higher density proposals associated with this planning tool has been to allow a town to meet its constitutional obligation to provide affordable housing.
Oh,
That is true. That has driven, in the last maybe 10 years, a lot of the redevelopment plans and the zoning changes in the regional growth areas, and to some extent the Pinelands town areas that have been reviewed by the commission. A lot of those have been driven by the need to meet an affordable housing obligation and zone for particular projects that are specifically called for in the affordable housing settlements. So we've seen that. And we have also seen an increased interest by municipalities in zoning for mixed use development, but also townhouses and apartments. There was a long period of time, 20, 25, 30 years ago, when municipalities were very opposed to zoning for that type of development. And really all we saw were ordinances and projects that were single family houses in the regional growth areas. Then, the market has changed, and there's a much greater interest now by residents and new home buyers and municipalities in accommodating all these different types of housing. And they only work at higher densities. You can't zone for apartments or townhouses at 2 units per acre. So we've really seen increased interest and willingness on the part of municipalities to zone for that type of development. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that that is great news for the Pinelands Development Credit Program, because that is where developers are, they're building at higher densities, they're building more units. We have been able to take advantage of that change in the market and build into the ordinances and redevelopment plans a requirement for the use of PDCs. And it has worked. And that is where the demand for credits is coming from right now in these higher density redevelopment areas, sometimes in association with a project that's also providing affordable housing. So these projects are not only being zoned for, but they are being built, which is evidence of the demand, I think. And the credits are being redeemed and the prices are rapidly increasing, which is, exactly how the program is supposed to work. So there's a lot of things that interact here and sort of, fit within each other, and one thing drives the other. But we definitely are seeing a change in the market in terms of type of housing. The affordable housing has really pushed a lot of that forward, not just in the Pinelands area, but throughout the whole state. And the Pinelands Development Credit Program and the owners of credits in the heart of the Pinelands as a result are also benefiting.
Any other questions?
Chairman, I would just say one other thing.
Sure.
I certainly agree with Commissioner Irick's concern. We do in the areas where we're allowing development, where we're concentrating development. I think this whole discussion just reminds us all that we do need to go back and finish the work so long ago begun about evaluating water use in the Pinelands. Should we be changing our rules on the basis of all the study that we've done over the past decade or more? Should we be changing our water use rules in the Pinelands?
Yes, and that'll be probably the next set of rules that finds its way to this committee. So we are continuing to work on those as well.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with those rules. Susan, which rules?
Those are the Kirkwood-Cohansey
Oh,
water supply
okay.
rule, the water conservation measures. We have a draft of that, and I've mentioned a couple times we've been working with now USGS on a means of implementing some of the requirements that are in those rules. So once we have that part of things nailed down, we will be back with another set of proposed rules for you to consider.
Okay. Is this the end of this discussion, or is this kind of the beginning of the discussion? Is this something that we come back to every now and then and further discuss? We were talking about a number of things here, open-ended things like should we do a study as to what kind of density in different areas?
Well, I guess I could just chime in that, since we are getting notices from DCA on areas that are being designated, we are aware that there are a number of redevelopment plans in the pipeline. So if for anything, it's certainly of benefit to sort of just, go over, the different statutory, requirements, but also just, that it seems like this is becoming a popular tool, and that, we should be paying attention to, issues that may come up. But I guess those are my initial thoughts.
And I think, as Brad mentioned, we are working with a number of municipalities right now on new redevelopment plans. I don't think there will be one for the commission to review until perhaps the April meeting, but they will continue to come up. And I think that will offer an opportunity for the committee to discuss again, as many times as necessary. If you have concerns with what a particular municipality is proposing, it may be that sparks a discussion of density or other standards that are in the development plan. We will continue to bring these to you to look at and discuss. So you'll have a continuing opportunity to look at them and identify any concerns you have.
Very good.
For Rick, I just add that from my perspective, I see the redevelopment and the rehabilitation programs that the state has established through law as just another tool our towns can use to reach their objectives. And I've driven by the on Route 530 past, as you know, the abandoned, more or less abandoned shopping center in Browns Mills. And I would much rather see that site used for expanded commercial than go to a green site somewhere down Route 530. So I commend Pemberton for working on that commercial redevelopment. It's a tool both for the commercial side and residential side and the affordable housing side. So I think I don't have a problem monitoring it, but I don't want to see any change in what the commission does in permitting towns to use a tool that's available statewide. That's just my perspective.
Well, I don't think we could change that, could we? I mean, we couldn't. I mean, that's a state program, redevelopment.
Well, you can put so many limitations on it that it doesn't work. I suppose you might think that way.
And we don't really have any limitations on it other than it has to fit within the CMP, right?
Correct. That's the current plan, which I support.
And my thinking also is, it doesn't matter whether we've seen the redevelopment plan or not. Each application has to come before the commission and follow the CMP. I mean, it's much better to see the redevelopment plan way before it's completed, so that the commission doesn't cause problems for the municipality or the developers. But we see every application, so we don't see these redevelopment plans or rehabilitation plans superseding the CMP. I hope I said that clearly, but
No, that's correct. Ultimately, any development that occurs in a redevelopment area or a rehabilitation area or whatever they want to call it has to come to the commission and demonstrate that they meet all of your environmental standards. So.
Well, thank you very much. This was a lot to prepare for and a lot to describe today. And on behalf of the committee. I really appreciate Sue and Brad for putting this together, and Nancy as well. I know she was interested in seeing that this information get before the commission to answer our questions. So thank you very much. Now, let's move on to the discussion of committee framework for review of agricultural issues. And I mentioned this at the last commission meeting, the suggestion of considering subcommittees for Policy and Implementation Committee and the Lucy's committees. I'd like to see some kind of an avenue for agricultural ideas and issues to come before the commission. I know a number of years ago we established an agricultural committee, but I don't think there were enough issues to maintain a full committee over time. But I would like to say, if commissioners agree with me, that we have a venue for perhaps, whenever there's an issue that most of us wouldn't be aware of, for, like, for example, Jerry, who's familiar with farming and familiar with agricultural policy in New Jersey, to bring that to a committee meeting. And then it could be mentioned in the summary at the commission meeting during the reports. So it could be something that is done, quarterly. It could be done whenever necessary within a committee. I certainly think the Lucy's committee could benefit from that information in that climate change is affecting a number of agricultural practices in the Pinelands, certainly cranberries and blueberries, and most likely other agricultural areas as well. And then the Policy Implementation Committee, water, but I guess that would go into Lucy's as well, but water and other issues, policies that might be of concern to farmers. So just throw that out there for the committee to discuss. What do you think?
I certainly agree with you, Chairman, about the need for us to consider climate impacts of applications, including agricultural applications. So I'm interested in the concept. I'm trying to see how practically it applies.
I'm sorry? Mark, what'd you say?
I'm curious to know how you're expecting this would work. I mean, for example, what sort of issue? Is it always a development application that you're saying should be considered by P&I or by Lucy's committee if it includes an agricultural component?
You mean if we're considering an application? Well, certainly that I think that would be beneficial for an agricultural subcommittee to weigh in. But I also think it would be good for agricultural subcommittee to weigh in on just issues that are not on our radar, that we don't have an application before us to evaluate. Just something that staff or these committees are even thinking about, but they might be thinking about it in the agricultural realm.
Oh, okay.
I can tell you that the agriculture community is looking very strongly at carbon sequestration. And we in the agriculture community are working on ways and methods to improve carbon sequestration. Whether this committee or the Lucy's committee is familiar with it, but from time to time, we could at least let the public know that that we are doing things other than pure applications.
I've always been impressed from hearing from Paul and yourself, Jerry, when you talk about water usage. I know you've always been concerned about there being enough water for agriculture, but yet not using all that capacity, being careful at conserving it. And I know I've heard from a number of agricultural people that, farmers, it's not to their advantage to use excess water. It's important for them to apply water to individual plants. So I think things like that are good to hear on a regular basis at committee meetings. Also, how the cranberries are being impacted and the blueberries are being impacted by climate change. I know the warming of the cranberries is causing some problem with cranberry production in New Jersey, and possibly with blueberries pollination. We were having problems with bees and perhaps other pollinators that are causing some concern there. I don't know that that would be a policy issue that we could take a look at, but just something to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so
I agree with these issues.
my thinking is, with the P&I committee, that on a monthly basis or whatever we meet, does the agricultural subcommittee have anything they want to report? Anything they want us to look to, or anything they want us to follow, and go from there. See how it might develop over time. Maybe that's not as detailed, not as much of a framework as we might like, but again, I just think it would be good just tap into the agricultural community and have some kind of response. Okay. All right. So,
Chairman.
Yes.
Chairman.
Yes. More.
May I take this opportunity, in view of what Commissioner Irick just said, to extend an invitation to Commissioner Irick to, if he would, to the Lucis Committee about what is going on in New Jersey agriculture with regard to carbon sequestration issues. We'd be most interested in becoming better informed about it. So I invite him to speak.
Mark, I have one suggestion also. When we put out the agenda for this meeting and it mentioned agricultural issues, we heard almost immediately from the State Agriculture Development Committee, SADC. A lot of people do follow along closely with the agendas, and they noticed that we were going to be discussing agricultural issues, and they wondered if there was anything in particular or any substantive policies to be discussed. And I said, no, not at this point, but they did offer to help with, whatever discussion or issues the commission or various committees might be interested in. SADC would be happy to help and serve as a resource to the committee in its discussion. So if we do at some point schedule, at the Lucis Committee, discussion of agricultural issues or how they relate to climate change, we should certainly reach out to SADC and take advantage of that resource. They're the experts. So in many of these issues. So
I wonder if they had any suggestions at that time. Were they thinking of any things that they'd like us to consider?
So far, no. I think they were more alarmed that perhaps the commission was proceeding with some discussion of agricultural issues that they didn't know about. So, but they are, we have a good relationship with a lot of their staff, and they're very, they'll be happy to help and come and talk about whatever topics we identify.
They've been tremendously helpful to us. They've been tremendously helpful to us in the past, and I would certainly welcome if they would have interest in speaking to the Lucis Committee on any climate issues that they're covering right now. We'd love to hear from them.
Well, I like the idea of having a marker out there, a venue of sorts that we can come back to agriculture all the time, as opposed to, whenever something comes up. It should be just a routine thing that we should take a look at. So, okay, so I guess at the next meeting, we'll ask if the agricultural committee subcommittee has anything to talk about, and I'll talk to some committee members to see if they'd like to be a part of this subcommittee, the agricultural subcommittee, and designate who is in that committee, and we'll go from there. And I guess, Mark, you could do the same with Lucy's committee if you'd like to do that.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, unless there's any other questions, I'm sorry to bewilder anyone on this, but it was just an idea again. I just want to recognize agriculture in the Pinelands, and nobody should be fearful of it, for sure. All right, so we're going to move on to public comment. Please call in now if you'd like to participate in public comment. And as I said before, the call-in information is on the screen, along with the identification number that you need to put in to comment. Nancy, do we have any reason to go into closed session today?
No, we do not.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to open up the meeting to public comment. Jessica, do we have any commenters at this point on the phone?
Yes, we do.
I'm sorry, I think it was more than 20 minutes, but it was a good discussion. All right, so who do we have on the line, Jessica?
Good morning, caller. Please state your name for the record.
Hi, this is Ryan Greck from Pinelands Preservation Alliance.
Good morning, Ryan. You're welcome to comment.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Hello, commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. I want to, regarding the stormwater amendment, I want to commend the staff. This was obviously a huge effort, and really applaud the changes being proposed to be adopted by the commission. I would just like to throw out a couple of additional suggestions for consideration. You know, certainly recognizing that these standards already go above those that the DEP has adopted and implemented. But we'd like to suggest additionally to incorporate non-structural stormwater requirements onto the site design. You know, basically using existing natural tools and systems to be incorporated into stormwater calculations and how it interacts with the overall site plan. You know, we certainly don't want a situation where developers can clear out vegetation and trees that already exist and replace it with rain gardens or other, you know, green stormwater infrastructure, and have that be approved. And, you know, this process could be overall detrimental to water quality, habitat, and water supply. And additionally, there should be increased protections for areas that provide water quality benefits or areas particularly susceptible to erosion and sediment loss. Another possibility would be for towns to require development to landscape with only native plants, you know, unless there are conditions or, you know, certain exceptions. Secondly, excuse me, you know, the new stormwater management or green infrastructure tools that would be constructed on a site should require a certain period of time, you know, 5 years of monitoring to guarantee the performance of the system. You know, just making sure that it's draining and functioning as designed. There could be, you know, a bonding requirement or some other financial guarantee that the systems would work long term, and that there would be money available for municipalities to address any issues. And then thirdly, we just had a really great overview of redevelopment projects from Brad. Thank you for that. And we'd suggest that redevelopment projects should be also required to meet stormwater requirements. You know, we certainly need to address past issues if we're going to truly be able to kind of move forward on improving water quality, especially in the face of our coming challenges regarding climate change. So in addition to just those kind of general suggestions, I did have just a few questions as the staff went through the presentation today. I understand that those might not be addressed now. I can certainly follow up with staff later, but I wanted to just, you know, throw those out there.
Sure.
Regarding the public linear projects and the exceptions for those, if the exception is granted, do those projects need to do off-site mitigation, as was discussed with some other types of projects? And I also wanted to just be clear for public linear projects, I was wondering if that includes pipelines or if that was simply, you know, things like roads and sidewalks. Secondly, I had a question about the study that is being done at the DEP level in partnership with Rutgers and Cornell to look at rainfall. And I'm wondering if that study, if that research is going to specifically do calculations for the Pinelands area, recognizing that soils in the Pinelands, the aquifer, the shallowness of the aquifer, these conditions are unique in New Jersey. There are certainly different rainfall considerations to be taken into account in the Pinelands as opposed to, for example, northern New Jersey. So I'm wondering if this research will specifically address the Pinelands area. And if not, maybe the commission would consider doing, a similar type of research for just the Pinelands area. Excuse me. Regarding the variances and the waivers of strict compliance that the DEP had proposed, I was interested by the discussion about, potentially allowing mitigation outside of the township if those conditions if the requirements cannot be met on site. I would be inclined certainly to agree with Commissioner Irick's statement, which is that, if the stormwater cannot be managed on site nor within the township boundaries, maybe the project shouldn't be included, approved on that site. But if the commission was considering allowing that mitigation outside the township, maybe it would have to be in the HUC 14 watershed, since that is, the commission is considering using just the HUC 11 watershed, and that's a little bit less restrictive than the DEP. So, maybe if this off-site mitigation has to go outside the township level, maybe it has to be within the HUC 14 watershed. And then finally, excuse me, I was really interested to hear about the consideration of herps being trapped in dry wells, and I'm happy to see the language that, it has to be, any dry wells that are constructed have to be safe for amphibians and reptiles. But I noticed that language was, I think it was just within the the minor development, and I'm wondering if that would be applied to any dry wells constructed anywhere, on any type of development in the Pinelands, and would encourage that it does apply to, any type of development. So I'll wrap up my comments there. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much. Would we like to address, answer any of these questions at this time? Staff or commissioners? Okay. We can move on, come back to that possibly. Jessica, is anyone else on the phone?
No, we had someone, but they hung up.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm going to give the public a little more time to call in, but I do want to talk about the exemptions, quote exemptions we were talking about at the last P&I meeting. I think Stacy suggested that we commissioners if we have questions or ideas regarding the exemptions, to send our questions into I guess Nancy to collect them, so that we can, I guess staff can be prepared for the next time we talk about the exemptions. I know I sent my questions in, or my points in any case. I'd also like to ask, I think it's a good idea for commissioners to send in, the questions for topics. And I'd also like to invite the public to do this as well. Commissioner Lobauer, you've talked about horizontal directional drilling as a topic for the P&I Commission to discuss. And I don't know that we all know which way to go with that at this point, but I think it might help for commissioners to write in any concerns that they have, anything they want explored, as well as the public. And if Nancy would be the person that would collect those and eventually then just send them out to the commission for our consideration. I was interested in bentonite, and I started to do some reviewing of that. And I found out that it's used for a whole bunch of, it's the material that's used to drill. it's used for a whole bunch of things, makeup, and I think it's in food, it's a number of things. But one of the remarks that I read about bentonite was it can have lead in it, and you need to have certified bentonite for different uses where there isn't any hazardous metals or hazardous materials in the bentonite. And the other thing I found out is bentonite has a pH of 9, and I'm just wondering how compatible is a pH of 9 in the Pinelands where you have acidic soil, pH of 5 or something, So, I mean, they're just some of my interests. I know Commissioner Avery was interested in the amount of, with horizontal drilling. Is it true that actually 50% of the time there are inadvertent spills? So these are all things I think we ought to have a collection of concerns and then maybe go to address them at some time in the future. So, yes.
Mr. Chair, I was reserving this for comments, but since you brought up horizontal directional drilling, I too have reviewed several technical papers on horizontal drilling methods and practices. And I conclude that I don't know enough about the process.
Wow.
We talk about bentonite, but on top of that, there is fluid pressures. And if the fluid pressure exceeds the tensile strength of the soil, you have an inadvertent return. And on top of that, soils ought to be tested before directional drilling is proposed. And I'm not sure that that's all been done in past projects. So my point would be that perhaps we should have a hydrogeologist professional from either academia, Rowan, or Rutgers give us a little bit more information concerning horizontal directional drilling.
Okay. So these are the things, if we could accumulate these ideas and then discuss them in full detail at a later meeting, that would be terrific. Jessica, is there anyone else on the phone?
No, sir.
Okay, I'm going to close the public comment at this time. And again, invite commissioners and the public to send in their concerns about or their interest in HDD for us to consider at some future meeting. All right. So Jessica, I'd like to thank you for managing the Zoom meeting today. It must have kept you on your toes with Verizon having its issues. It certainly shows how flexible we all are with Zooming, even though that there were some garbled voices, but we had a great meeting today. So with that, do commissioners have any comments at this time? Okay.
I'd like to thank the staff for the exemplary work on the stormwater amendments.
Mm-hmm. Does the executive director have anything to say at this time?
No.
Okay. Any other commissioners?
Rick, the only thing that I would say, and obviously the commission's going to discuss whatever it wants to, but from the staff's perspective, I think it's indicative of the thoroughness with which they brief the commission on issues that we raise, that we don't overburden them or will slow the already slow process of getting things like the Kirkwood Cohansey and the stormwater regulations and so forth. Takes a lot of work to put something like today. And we ought to be mindful of that and not, we're going to talk about, as I said, talk about what we want to talk about, but be careful. Keep that in mind, the amount of effort that it takes to make a presentation like today's. Excellent presentations.
So it certainly was a lot of work, and I think your point is well taken. Perhaps with the HDD situation, it might not be staff that has to do all that research. It could be commissioners, it could be the public sending in information, and then in the end, maybe staff could recap. But yeah, again, I'm not saying that, or suggesting that the HDD, we will have it as a topic in the next couple of months, somewhere down the line, we can talk about HDD. So, okay, anything else? With that, I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Move that we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Any abstentions? No. Okay, folks, thanks. Terrific meeting. Thanks to staff. Thanks to commissioners. We all do a heck of a lot of work, and it's much appreciated.